Mean Girls is a 2004 cult classic teenage comedy film that 20 years later pop media still continues to make references to. Directed by Mark Waters and written by Tina Fey, the movie centers around a clique of teenage girls known as the Plastics who come together to bully and rule their high school. The film is a great example of social psychology's theoretical concepts and its real-life applications. Thus, the purpose of this podcast is to examine how Mean Girls is representative of psychological concepts regarding group processes, such as groupthink, bystander effect, and de-individualization, and analyzing their correlation to everyday life. I want to first begin by defining the topics. What good is talking about them if nobody knows what they mean, right? Alright, so groupthink is defined as a group decision-making style characterized by an excessive tendency among members to seek concurrence. What this typically means is that the need for agreement takes priority over the motivation to abstain from accurate information and decisions. This word was first coined in 1952 by William J. White Jr. to critique word culture, but it wasn't until Irving Janis, a research psychologist from Yale University, did the first initial scientific research on groupthink. He would kickstart an interest in this concept with his publication of his book in 1972, Victims of Groupthink. Indeed, within the setting of the high school of Mean Girls, every student is a victim of the idea that the Plastics and their leader, Regina, are to be praised and treated as gods. Within 8 minutes and 30 seconds into the movie, students explain the various ways Regina is amazing. She does car commercials in Japan. This all cultivates with one final student saying, "She punched me in the face. It was awesome." What? Irving Janis's idea of groupthink is clearly demonstrated with this scene. There is a certain peer pressure to conform to this appraisal of the most popular girl at school and her group. Again, according to Janis, 3 characteristics contribute to the development of groupthink. Number 1, highly cohesive groups. Number 2, similar backgrounds and isolation from society while being directed by a strong leader. And number 3, stressful situations. The movie being set in a high school already lets us know that there is a similar age range, a similar race demographic, and being 7 hours every day from society. These factors, in addition to a charming leader, Regina, leads to group thinking, as individuals are less likely to avoid raising controversial opinions, such as not liking the Plastics and Regina. This is important when analyzing the movie through a real-life lens because although dramatized for entertainment, this situation applies to many people, including myself, because although to a smaller extent, groupthink does affect how my school operates and how people choose to do certain clothing, certain behavior, and seeing it from an outside perspective lets me know how powerful groupthink really does affect me on a personal level. We can explore the topic of group processes further through talking about our next concept, de-individualization, defined as a state where you become so immersed in the norms of the group that you lose your identity and personal responsibility. This is otherwise known as diffusion of responsibility because it leads to less feelings of personal guilt. The word was first coined by American social psychologist Leon Festinger in the 1950s. Today, the Stanford Prison Experiment by Zimbardo stands as the most popular example of de-individualization. Looking at the film through these lenses, the social psychological concept is evident when the main character, Katie, who has entered high school after being homeschooled in Africa all her life, gets integrated into their social norms. It's at 51 minutes and 15 seconds into the movie when the main character, Katie, is fully engulfed into the norms of the Plastics, losing her identity. No more is a socially awkward, but instead the makeup-obsessed, boy-crazy teenage girl that blends in with the other girls in the Plastics. This is why when the other girls in the clique engage in toxic behavior such as writing horrible rumors about the girls at school in a burn book, Katie releases personal guilt because this is just the norm for the Plastics. These social norms and loss of identity for Katie lead her to not feel bad about the devious bad actions of the group. Additionally, the social psychological concept of bystander effect heavily correlates to Mean Girls. Before I continue, I need to first define the concept of bystander effect. It's defined when the presence of others discourages an individual from intervening in an emergency situation. The greater amount of bystanders, the less likely any one of them is likely to provide help. This is portrayed 1 hour and 4 minutes into the movie when the Plastics, excluding Regina, are taken to the principal's office due to the burn book being made public. But because all 3 girls were taken into the office, they all claimed they had never seen the book before. There being multiple girls meant that the amount of bystanders was high and the sense of responsibility was low, meaning that none of the girls felt like they had to own up to writing the book. This is a vivid example of how bystander effect could appear in real life social settings, such as a workplace or school environment, and how blame could be impacted and whether, someone decides to fess up, someone decides to confess. Thus, the purpose of this podcast was to examine how Mean Girls is representative of psychological concepts regarding group processes such as groupthink, bystander effect, and de-individualization in analyzing the correlation to everyday life. The film's dramatized portrayal gives an audience an retrospective glance at their own lives and how these concepts play a hand in their behavior. I know it did for me. Because during my research for this podcast, I learned that my high school experience is similar to that of the school from Mean Girls. There is a lot of rumors, cliques, and social structures that lead to certain trends being the norm, and being the outgroup tends to lead to exclusion. Furthermore, I found myself interested in revisiting these concepts as I had already explored them in my college social psychology class as well as my AP psychology class in high school. Having this prior knowledge allowed me to spend my energy focusing on how it connected to the pop media that I chose instead of having to learn what they meant. Additionally, because I had to analyze a piece of pop media, I viewed Mean Girls through a new academic lens that made me more understanding of the purpose of the film. There's a reason it's a cult classic. It's because it's good on every point, whether it's viewing it through a social lens or simply academic lens, like I did in this podcast.